Hi, I'm Stephen Tryon. I founded accountabilitycitizenship.org to build and sustain a community of positive, informed, and engaged citizens. And in light of current events, I have undertaken a series of videos examining the FY 2026 budget, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that Congressional Republicans rushed to pass by the 4th of July at the urging of the president. Normally, since FY 2026 doesn't start until the 1st of October, the months of July and September are set aside for public hearings on various aspects of the budget to ensure that the public is informed and that we get the best budget possible. That's not what happened this year. In this video, I will provide a summary of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, the law that defines the process Congress is supposed to use to create a budget each year. I will define the concept of a baseline, which is basically a snapshot of the current fiscal posture of the U.S. government. I will provide an overview of the Congressional Budget Office baseline from January of 2025, which is the baseline Congress must use, according to the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, to evaluate all legislation coming before the current Congress, including the FY 2026 budget legislation. And then using the 6 purposes for the United States government, as laid out in the first paragraph of our Constitution, I will consider what a good budget should have looked like. Let me give you the bottom line up front. The FY 2026 federal budget was not produced in accordance with existing law. It was not produced in accordance with the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. It violates the standards set by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. Congressional Republicans invented a made-up baseline to hide the true fiscal effects, the damaging fiscal effects of this budget that they've just passed. Let's talk about something called a baseline. That's a concept that I wrote about in my first book in 2013. On page 44, 2 distinct agencies provide budget estimates. The Office of Management and Budget provides budget analysis for the President, and the Congressional Budget Office provides analysis for Congress. Each agency uses something called a baseline, which projects the current level of spending into the future. Each baseline incorporates assumptions about inflation and other economic variables. OMB's baseline, also known as current service estimates, covers 5 years, while the CBO's baseline budget projections cover 10 years. Policy, budget proposals, and legislation are scored in reference to one or the other baseline. The normal procedure assigns a score based on the impact of the policy proposal or legislation over the full period of the baseline used. Now, as you might expect, the Congressional Budget Office baseline is what Congress uses to score its legislation. In other words, to determine whether any piece of legislation is going to add to the deficit or to the federal debt, or whether it's going to improve the fiscal standing of the United States relative to its current debt posture. Let's take a look at the Congressional Budget Office's baseline produced in January of 2025, pursuant to the requirements set forth in the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, pursuant to existing law. And then, considering the 6 purposes for our government set forth in the first paragraph of our Constitution, let's consider what we should expect Congress to have done given the baseline and the current fiscal posture of our country. So before we dive into the specifics of the elements of this whiteboard, let's just talk about the requirements of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, some of the highlights. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 established the Congressional Budget Office. In Section 605, it directs the executive branch to provide a projection of the country's financial situation for the next several years if no laws are changed based on the current expenditures. It also, in Section 405, directs the Congressional Budget Office to analyze the executive branch projection in light of the best economic data available, creating a baseline, its own baseline, the CBO baseline. Now, in Section 313 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, something that's called the Byrd Rule, there's a series of requirements that limit what can be considered when budget bills are being brought before the Congress. There was a tendency for people to attach a whole bunch of pet projects, if you will, to these bills because they knew everybody was going to just vote for them at a certain point. And so the idea of Section 313 was to limit what could be added into the consideration of a budget bill when it was coming before Congress. And one of the things that Section 313 specifically prohibits is any measure that increases the deficits after the 10-year Congressional Budget Office baseline period. So for FY 2026, the 10-year baseline budget period goes basically through 2034. And anything that increases the deficits after 2034, according to the CBO baseline, can be stricken and should be stricken from the law based on Section 313 of the Congressional Budget Act. That didn't happen with the FY 2026 budget. And it couldn't happen because the budget that they passed, the budget that the president signed, according to the Congressional Budget Office baseline, not only increases deficits by $3.5 trillion over the 10-year period, but it also increases deficits outside of the 10-year period in violation of Section 313, in violation of existing law. So now let's turn and look specifically at what the Congressional Budget Office January 2025 baseline said. If you look here at the lower left hand of this whiteboard, the CBO January 25 baseline highlights. First of all, the current federal debt, $36.2 trillion, 123% of our gross domestic product, 123% of all the goods and services produced in the United States for FY25. That's the level of our debt. The FY34 debt, projected based on current expenditures with no changes, will grow to $59.2 trillion, which is 134% of gross domestic product in FY34. So we're accounting for the growth of the economy, and we're still creating or growing into a position where our debt is worse in FY34 than it is now. That alone should tell you that when Congress crafted the FY 2026 budget, they should have done something to address that. That's a significant issue. FY25 interest spend is $952 billion. It's the second largest item in the budget behind Social Security, is interest on the current debt. The FY25 mandatory spend, including the interest spend, is $4.2 trillion. $4.2 trillion that Congress has no say in. That is just required spend by the government. The FY25 revenue projected at 17.4% of GDP, which is $5.4 trillion for FY25. The 50-year average revenue projection is 17.3% of GDP. So the revenue that we project coming in is about the same over the last 50 years. It's been fairly stable as a percent of gross domestic product. And then the FY25 gross domestic product projected at 29.4 trillion and will grow as our economy grows over the next 10 years to 43.9 trillion in FY34. So given those facts, what might we have expected Congress to do with the FY 2026 budget process? Well, what's the purpose of our government? Again, here in the first paragraph of the Constitution, it says that we established our government to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Let's just start with the last one. If you're going to pass a budget that's going to make the debt for future generations far worse than what it currently is, you certainly cannot claim that you're securing the blessings of liberty to yourselves or your posterity. You're actually compromising the ability of future generations to make choices and spend money to address the emergencies that they're going to have to deal with. Now, what we might have expected Congress to do, I've highlighted with some sticky notes here, if you will, off to the side of those purposes of government. If we're looking at just things like forming a more perfect union and establishing justice and ensuring domestic tranquility, in light of this debt problem, and we're looking at cutting federal spending from some key programs, we should stop spending money on activities like the anti-DEI initiatives and the renaming of federal bases. That caused extra spend in the budget, and it's unnecessary spend that undermines the unity of our country. It doesn't increase or improve the unity of our country. What else? Well, we can protect access to health care and we can protect access to Social Security. Given the fiscal posture, given the fact that we've got this debt problem, we have to establish priorities. And the priorities of the American people are health care, Social Security, things like that need to be protected. We're experiencing an awful lot of environmental catastrophes, whether it's wildfires or flooding in New Mexico, Texas, California, wherever. We're experiencing these things, and then hurricanes and tornadoes. Well, in light of those kinds of emergencies that recur every year now, we need to make sure that we fund the Federal Emergency Management Agency, provide for the government's ability to come in and help American citizens when they face these disasters. We need to reduce the level of spending to the level of projected revenue. Now, that's a big one, and it may not be possible to do that right away. In fact, it probably isn't possible to do that right away. But that doesn't mean we can't make a start at it. That doesn't mean that we can't set a reasonable target to reduce deficits going forwards to a level that is going to allow for the growth of the economy over that 10-year period. Remember, we know that according to the CBO projection, economy is going to grow from $29.4 trillion GDP to $43.9 trillion in GDP. We can leverage that growth if we're smart about what the government is spending in order to improve the debt posture of the United States government. That's what Congress should have done with the FY2026 budget, and that's what they failed to do. We need to reduce the debt and the interest spending as a percent of GDP. We need to put the next generation of leaders into a better position than we are in currently. And we could do that if we were smart about planning our spend over the course of this baseline period as measured against the growth of our economy. That's not what we did. Now, in my next video, I'm going to highlight exactly what happened and how the Senate Republicans and the Congressional Republicans manipulated the process to deceive the American people, really, and to use a baseline that is inconsistent with the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. By doing that, the FY 2026 budget that they passed and that they sent to the president and that the president signed into law is at least deceptive and probably illegal. Any member of Congress who supported the FY 2026 budget should be held accountable. Should be held accountable in the midterms. They should be fired. They should be replaced with somebody else because they didn't do their job. They violated the law and they put our country at risk with a bad budget. This bill increases deficits by $3.5 trillion. So we'll look at the specifics of what the Congressional Republicans did in the next video. But for now, I hope you've gotten a good understanding of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, a good understanding of what baselines are and how they're used to help us manage our budget, and an understanding of what Congress could have done with the FY 2026 process, what the opportunity was that they squandered by catering to the president's whims and passing this thing that he signed into law on the 4th of July. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you very much.